take a look at how we can use socket communication from a Silverlight application. This is by no means common. It's quite a rare thing to want to do, but it is a capability of Silverlight. So what I want to do is, from a Silverlight application, open a socket to another application and communicate with it that way, rather than something higher level like HTTP. So the first thing I've done is built a little socket server on my own machine. Let's take a look at that. So this is just .NET Framework 3.5 code, and really all I'm doing, it's very intentionally simple. I create a socket, I bind it to any network card and port 4502. I call listen. I do this synchronously just to make it easy, and I just loop forever, accepting any incoming socket, and then again, really to be lazy, I kick off a new thread to manage the communication with that incoming socket, and all I do is I continuously read data from that incoming socket, and anything I receive I write it out to the console, and finally we close off the socket and that thread will disappear. Meanwhile, our main thread will carry on accepting the next socket, and so on and so forth. So it's a simple socket based server, and it listens, as we say, on port 4502. So what we'll do is just close that down, we'll press F5 on it, and it's going to sit there running away until we tell it to stop, until somebody talks to it as well. What I've then got is a Silverlight application. So over here we have a Silverlight application, and my Silverlight application is a standard thing. We have a website, we have a Silverlight app that's used by that website, and at the moment on the UI all we've got is a text box, and it's called text to send, and we have a button that's got the label send, and let's just go and put a click handler behind that, which we'll call on send. So the idea is that you type some text into here, you click send, we open a socket to that server I just showed you, and we send the data across to that server. That's really the idea of it. Let's go to the code behind this, and let's write an event handler for on send. So the first thing we're going to want to do in here is open a socket. So let's say socket, socket, and in fact I think I'm going to need to keep this around, so let's put it here, and we'll say socket equals new socket, and we're going to be using IP, we have a socket type of stream, and we're going to use protocol type of TCP. Okay, so that's fine. Now the way this API works is we create an instance of a thing called a socket async event args. I'll call this args, oh that's a bad name, socket args equals new one of those, and one of the things we can set here is the remote endpoint. I'm going to set that to a new IP endpoint, and I'll get that by doing IP address.parse. My local machine is 192.168.0.10, and I'm trying to talk to port 4502, which is where my socket server that you just saw is listening. So we start by creating that. Now the other thing we need to set for this socket args is a routine to call when the async operation completes. So what we want to do is set completed plus equal, let's say, on connect completed, something like that. So we'll throw in a handler for connect completed. Let's just do that, and let's just remove those braces. So now we're going to call this routine here when the connect's completed, and then what we go and do is say dot connect async and pass it those socket args. Okay, so that's going to tell it what routine to call, and when we arrive over in this routine over here, I guess the first thing we should do is say completed minus equals on connect complete to take away that event handler again. Now there's one other thing I want to do in onSend. I want to talk to the UI thread and get the bytes that I'm going to send across the network. So I'm going to say byte, let's say bytes equals, I'm just going to say encoding.unicode.getBytes from the text that we have on the screen, which is text to send.text. So now we've got a bunch of bytes. I also want to pass those bytes across into this connect routine. So just for, I don't know, ease, I guess, I suppose we could put them into a member variable. Let's do that. So let's say bytes, and then we'll just copy those bytes there. Why am I doing this here? It's because this potentially is on a different thread, and I want to get this certainly on my UI thread before we get over here. So we got the bytes that we want to send. now over in this function we should probably check to see if e.socketError equals success, because otherwise it didn't work. So let's assume that we did connect the socket to the remote place. So what we now want to do is set up a new socket async event args. Let's call this args. We'll create a new one of those. And onto this we want to call .setBuffer. And on setBuffer there what we want to do is set the buffer that we've got, which for us is bytes 0, and we want to send bytes.length is what we want to send down the socket. We want to set up the completed event again, so let's say completed plus equals, and let's say on send completed to throw in a handler for that. And we'll just go ahead and sort of fix that up a little bit. And then finally what we want to do is socket.sendAsync. And we use that args argument to tell it what to send, which is the buffer that we just set. In send completed down here, what we'll do is we'll just close our socket. Okay, so let's see if we can compile that. Let's see if we can run this. Let's press F5. So we type something into our text box. Let's go and put some debugger breakpoints in here so we can see what happens. We'll connect completed and send completed. Let's try clicking the send button. We can see that connect completed. Did we get an error or not from this? It looks like that worked. Let's press F5. It looks like the send worked. Let's press F5. So the Silverlight application thinks it sent data. Let's find the command window for the other application. And you can see there is the text appearing in the socket application. So let's do hello world. We'll send that over there. We get our breakpoints. And over here, there we see hello world. So we have the Silverlight application talking to the socket application over sockets. We could do two-way duplex communication as well. It's important to realize. Now, if you followed me so far, I'm about to make things a little bit more complicated because I haven't shown you everything yet that's going on in this scenario. There is another piece of software involved that we haven't seen yet. I've made it look a little bit simpler than it actually is. So let's just shut this down, and let's just shut the Silverlight application down. And let's go back to this Silverlight application. Now, so far I've made it look like you are just allowed from a Silverlight application to open a socket to a remote machine, whether that be the same machine you started on or not. That's not actually true. What happens is when we try and connect this socket here, there's another piece of software in play, and it's a piece of software that serves up a client access policy that says whether Silverlight is allowed to open a port onto this remote machine or not. So I've had that sneakily running here in the background. Let's shut it down. So we still have our socket service. Let's run that up. So now we have the socket service running. Let's go back to the website. Let's test and see what happens without that extra piece of software. So let's just type something in here, ABC send. And we should see, I would expect, if we look at a watch window here, that we've got a socket error of access denied. So without this additional piece of software, we're going to get access denied. Now, what is this additional piece of software doing? Okay, so let's take a look at that. What we've got is another application. Let's have a look at that. It's another socket-based application. And essentially what this application does is it's listening on port 943. That's a well-known port for Silverlight. So it's actually using this port 943. And in my simplistic case, all it does is it accepts incoming sockets, it receives whatever they've got to say. Now actually this program should be checking that request that comes in because the Silverlight application makes a particular request. I'm kind of ignoring it right now. And it sends down that incoming socket a bunch of bytes that it's read from a file up here. And if we have a look at that file, what that file is a client access cross-domain policy. So you can see that this cross-domain policy here says that you can come from any URI and you can speak to port 4502 over TCP. Without this policy being returned down socket 943, you wouldn't be able to make that socket call from a Silverlight application. So what happens is back in the Silverlight application, let's just see that over here, when we first come in and try and make this connection, Silverlight first goes to this machine on port 943 looking for the security policy. It gets the policy and checks it to see whether the machine allows a connection to this port. If it does, it then goes ahead and makes a connection. So just to try and make that crystal clear, let's go and set some different breakpoints. We'll forget the Silverlight breakpoints for a second, but I'm going to go to this security service that we've got, and we'll put a breakpoint in here for when it sends this security policy. Let's run it up. That's the security service. Let's go to the regular socket service, and we'll go to this and put a breakpoint in here for when it receives something from Silverlight. Let's run this up. So now we have two socket services listening, the security one and the regular one. Let's go back to the Silverlight app and press F5. And what we're hoping to see when we make a connection from Silverlight and send some data here is a connection firstly into the security service, which is returning our policy to say whether Silverlight can connect to port 4502 or not. Let's run on. Now we see the real socket service, which has got some data from Silverlight and is writing it to the console. So you see that interaction essentially. Let's just let that run and run on. And there's our ABC that we received from Silverlight. So essentially you see that interaction. Firstly we call and ask for the policy on port 943, and only then when the policy allows us to access do we actually go through and call the end socket service. So there are quite a few things in there. Hopefully get an idea that we can call sockets. It's not just one way as I showed you here, it's full duplex communication, and what we have to set up in terms of access policy and a little security server in order to make that work.